And who better to talk to about the government than my friend Rick Esenberg? I just was with him Tuesday night. Big Will, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty Gala at the Italian Community Center, one of my favorite places. Certainly a bias built in. Pleasure to have you on the show, Rick.
Thanks for having me.
So we were gathered together Tuesday night. You had a great speaker, Guy Benson, who does stuff on Fox, national radio show, talking about the debate and the election. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that night, but a great job by Will and your organization putting together a lot of great folks at Will, and a lot of them are guests on my program, as you are. But a couple things stood out to me, and one was his analysis, Guy Benson's analysis of the debate, and how he said, and I think it's a fair assessment, that Donald Trump clearly didn't prepare. He sort of called his friends before the debate and basically had them, buoy his spirits, or whatever you want to use, whatever terminology you want to use. And then on the other side, Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, basically didn't have to answer a question, but she baited Donald Trump. And I thought the analysis was both simple but brilliant. That's what we saw last week.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he pulled no punches. As a debate, Trump lost. I was a pretty good high school debater back in the day.
I can imagine that.
I tweeted out earlier in the debate that these people are not good at this.
No,
neither one of them. And the problem is he didn't prepare, and he didn't listen to what I'm sure his advisors were drilling into him. Don't allow her to bait you. Don't talk about the size of your rallies. Don't talk about dogs and cats. But he couldn't help himself. He's solipsistic and he's undisciplined. She, on the other hand, did a pretty good job of baiting him. I think that they had prepared well to do that. But what she didn't do a good job of is telling the American people what she's about. She didn't introduce herself to the public. The debate became about Donald Trump. Everybody knows what they think about Donald Trump, for good or ill. They still don't know what to think about Kamala Harris. And so, although she won the debate, it's not clear what else she won.
Do debates, in your opinion, have that same import that they used to? I mean, they used to be like sort of game changers, serious, solemn events, two people at a desk talking back and forth. Are they that anymore?
Well, I mean, I think they can, but I think something big has to happen. I don't think that they have an impact because, there are undecided voters out there who are judging this the way, my school day debates were judged. I give you 4 for speaker points. I give you 5 for plan meets need, all that kind of stuff. What matters is something coming out of the debate that can be talked about. And here we got the dogs and cats. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people who live there. I don't know how much that really changes anything.
What do you make of, and I have a lot of Republican strategists on the show, and I talk to a lot of them away from the show, and they say, if we can just get them to focus on the message, economics, what are we going to do for America that this administration, the Biden administration, has failed to do, leading to some serious challenges for people's gas and groceries? But yet they say that, and it's at the highest level. It's the Reince Priebus's, it's the Scott Walkers, it's the Chris Lasavitas, it's the Susie Wiles. They tell him to do this, but he doesn't follow that direction.
Right. For Donald Trump, what you want to do is you want to focus on the fact that, Biden is an unpopular president. People don't like what's happened during the Biden administration. And Kamala Harris, he wants to paint as being way too left of center for the American public. And that shouldn't be a hard thing to do. He's got a lot of ammunition to use. What he shouldn't do is talk about himself and how much people love him and how big his rallies are. And in my view, he should drop the economic nonsense, because we have 2 presidential candidates who basically are speaking economic nonsense. And, a lot of Republicans, I think, are voting for Trump because they think he doesn't mean it. And maybe he doesn't. But
his latest, he wants to cap credit card interest rates. Did you ask the finance banking industry what they thought about that idea? I mean, that's not a popular idea among those groups who, by the way, have a lot of sway.
Right. I mean, what he's doing now is he's just grasping for anything that people will like. So you won't have to pay taxes on tips. You won't have to pay taxes on Social Security. I'll bring back the state and local tax deduction.
Which he's signed, by the way.
yeah.
It's sort of inconsistent.
I just think that's irresponsible. That's not a serious proposal. On the other hand, she thinks that she can control grocery prices. She thinks that she can control pharmaceutical prices. We're in a country that has a tremendous deficit problem, and she's talking about giveaways of her own. I don't think either one of these economic programs are even trying to be serious or respond to the very real problems that we have.
Rick Esenberg, president of Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, great organization, was at their gala on Tuesday night at the Italian Community Center. Fun night, seeing all the local conservatives and friends that I sometimes only see once a year. Jeff Wagner was in the crowd. I hadn't seen him in a while since he left our airwaves, so it was great to see Jeff. All right, after the break, November 5th, Election Day, before and after, all the legal stuff that Rick knows very well, having argued cases in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Where might all of this go? What might happen? Will we have a result? Lots more politics to talk about with Rick Esenberg on the Political Power Hour, 620 WTMJ. Great guest on this Thursday, legal edition of Political Power Hour, 620 WTMJ. My friend Rick Esenberg, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. A lot of great folks working there, and they're all great follows, by the way. Those of their staff who are on Twitter. Give them a follow. They are fun to kind of see what they're working on and see where this goes. And if you don't think Will is a great organization, look at your success rate. What was the slide you put up? The cases you go after, working on behalf of clients who you don't charge, by the way, your success rate was in the 80s.
Yeah, it hovers right around 80%. We get what we wanted about 80% of the time.
Pretty impressive.
Well, it is, particularly since we don't take easy cases.
Right.
And if the law is clear, we're not going to take it because that's not what we're here for.
All right. So the sort of the swirling question around, we sort of moved all the Trump, we'll probably talk about a little bit, the Trump cases aside for now, because most of those are pushed off or gone. But there's a lot of questions about what states, what organizations, what campaigns might do legally, either before or after. The before part, I don't know what they can do other than changing some laws, and maybe you have knowledge about this. I don't. On what states are sort of doing to clarify, like, who can vote, clean up voter rolls. That's a legal process, which has probably been underway for a long time. But after election night, while we're all waiting to see who won, I get the sense, and maybe you hear more than I do, that both campaigns are like gearing up this crew of lawyers and attorneys, same thing, that are going to go after results they don't like. What do you make of all this?
Well, I think they expect the election to be close. So we ask ourselves, when we talk about polls, we ask ourselves whether they're within the margin of error. When we get election results, we ask ourselves whether they're within the margin of litigation. And it, particularly since it's not going to be the national results that matter, it's going to be the result in these battleground states, which the polls seem to indicate are razor thin. And so the question is, is there something you can do? Is there arguments that you can make to challenge the results? And last time we had, I think there were sort of two sets of claims. One set of claims had to do with state departures from state law that were enacted or that were engaged in. They weren't enacted. They were engaged in due to the COVID pandemic.
Right. Wisconsin, a clear example.
Right. And in Wisconsin, there was a case that was brought before the United States Supreme Court by Jim Troupis. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that, in that case, Troupis and the Trump campaign made no argument about fraud. They weren't talking about fabricated ballots. They weren't talking about ballots that were tossed. They weren't talking about any of that stuff. They were talking about the way in which absentee ballots were cast. They were arguing that they had been cast in a way that was contrary to state law. And our state law does say, you can read it, it's 684 sub 2, that absentee ballots that are cast improperly may not be counted. They made that argument. They lost that argument on a legal doctrine called latches, which basically means if you sit on your rights too long, you lose them.
Right.
And this time, maybe there won't be that argument, at least not to the same degree. But, there are all sorts of things, anomalies, things that can happen, stories that fly around. I mean, I remember in 2020, there were all sorts of stories that were being claimed. And at least initially, it's hard to know whether they're true or not. Somebody says, I saw this. And until you have some opportunity to check that out, you don't know. So given the fact that the election is likely to be very, very close, given the fact that we probably won't know who won Pennsylvania, which may be the thing that decides the election is Pennsylvania, because they have this process that involves the later counting of votes. I think that there may be lawfare following the election by whichever side is not declared the winner, in much the same way we saw as 2000.
So the two forces meet. One, the public, the voters, want to know who won their state, want to know who won the electoral college in the states that matter in that tally. But at the same time, there's legal challenges that you and I both know take a lot of time. But there's deadline, there's benchmarks. States have to certify their votes. Congress has to certify the election electorally. How do you make all of that sort of jive so that we're not dragging these things out beyond like reasonable deadline?
They're going to have to go at breakneck speed like they did the last time. Now, I know people like to think that legal proceedings last way too long, and to some extent, they're right. They do. On the other hand, to try to resolve these difficult and complicated issues within the space of a matter of weeks is also very, very difficult and, can lead to errors and omissions. But I don't think that there's any real alternative for it because, as you say, there are deadlines and the Electoral Count Act has been fixed and it's been made stronger. And so I think that we may see, unfortunately, the same flurry of litigation and the litigation is fine if that's what we have. Like, we're going to go to court. We're going to make reasoned arguments about what happened and what didn't happen. The judges are going to decide and we're going to accept whatever the court does. Unfortunately, given the passions that arise at this point, it's not really possible to say that we won't have one way or another, some kind of at least echo of what happened after the election in 2020, and that's extremely unfortunate because neither side can contemplate accepting defeat.
He's always great to talk to. Rick Esenberg he's in studio for the whole hour today. We're going to continue that conversation on all of that because Justice Brian Hagedorn from the Wisconsin Supreme Court was in the studio the other day. And he made a comment that basically our founders would roll in their graves if they knew that the legislature and Congress were just handing over everything to the courts. I'm going to get Rick's response to that and a lot more. We're just getting warmed up on the Political Power Hour, 620 WTMJ. Great guest today, Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. If folks want to find out more about your organization, where do they go?
www.will-law.org.
And I encourage you to do that. I know we all disagree about politics. That's sort of the culture we live in now. And understanding what people think, understanding what organizations do, not the social media version of that, but actually the hard work that's done by organizations, left or right, conservative or liberal, Democrats, Republicans, is actually sort of beneficial, especially if you want to improve the quality of your gray matter. All right, I had Brian Hagedorn, Justice from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And he made the comment, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, the founders would roll over in their graves if they realized how much power we're taking from our legislature and our Congress and handing it off to courts. Your thoughts?
Yeah, courts are the executive. So you were at our dinner earlier this week. You mentioned Guy Benson's speech. There was a speech before that by me.
Yeah, very good speech.
One of the things that I was trying to emphasize is that we have a particular type of democracy in the United States, and our Constitution, both nationally and at the state level, consists of separation of powers and checks and balances. We have three branches of government. Each must play its role. And the result of that is the public policy, if we're going to make public policy, we have to make it by consensus. And this is the thing that keeps a very diverse, plural society in which many, many people disagree together. It makes it hard for our opponents to vanquish us so we can live with them. And it makes it hard for us to to vanquish them, so they must live with us. And so I think people say, well, why do you guys at Will worry about separation of powers and how a particular public policy is enacted, as you did in COVID? And that's the reason. All of this stuff, checks and balances, separation of powers, this isn't technicality. This isn't empty legalese. There's a great book out by Yuval Levin called American Covenant, and he explains how it is these procedural elements about how decisions are going to be made that keep us together.
Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. We're going to spend another half hour talking about things like what Jack Smith is up to, any impact of his decisions or his work against former President Donald Trump that'll impact the election. That's all coming up. Local news, of course, the latest from ABC. Don't forget, tomorrow morning, Bill McCosh and Joseph Pecky, and I know watching the text exchange between these gentlemen, they are very, very focused on the show tomorrow. We got a lot to talk about with my two strategist friends, Bill and Joe. Sometimes when you're talking in the breaks, something comes in your head, and you were talking about the Reagan movie, which I have not seen, but I've heard a lot about, and I noticed on your video presentation before the speakers at the gala, the Will Gala on Tuesday night, Ronald Reagan was primarily featured, and as a Republican voter and sometimes conservative, unless they irritate me, and you're certainly a conservative, although some people even call you a rhino, which is just the most insane thing in the world. You did that on purpose, though. The Reagan comparisons, it's clear that we're missing something here.
Right. I think what we're missing is a certain civility, a respect for our constitutional order, and a vision of the Republican Party, at least, as a party of limited government, individual liberty, and a robust civil society. And in my view, anyway, Reagan stood for that imperfectly, as any politician is imperfect. But we thought that imagery was the appropriate imagery to evoke, to kind of help convey the message of why we do what we do.
Yeah, and I get the sense that there's a lot of Republicans like me who are sort of asking for a return to that. And it would be a hard lesson if Donald Trump lost, and this sort of leads to my next question for Donald Trump specifically, because he is facing multiple legal challenges in many jurisdictions that, frankly, if he loses the election and all of that happens the way it happens with court challenges and all this stuff, but we get to some point where he's lost the election. I'm not saying that's going to happen. He could easily win the election. This is a crazy election year. He's going to be facing all of this stuff, and I wonder, Jack Smith or some of the judges in these cases, and you probably know way better than I do, what that is all going to be like with a former president facing all of that legal mess after having lost, and again, I'm not predicting he's going to lose, but if he does, what that feels like for our country. We're putting a former president on trial. We've already had some of that. In the most visible sense possible, someone who has lost an election. You live in that world. What is that?
Right,
like?
and not only that, but like basically an 80-year-old man.
Yeah,
and I think it would be better for the country if Smith and the others found a way to stand down, maybe by striking some type of a face-saving deal, because I think that. We're going to have enough problems during the next presidential administration, and I think I know that there are these people that who think, well, this is like a truth and reconciliation proceeding. I think that's crazy and nuts and ridiculous. I think that what we need is what we're going to need is to turn the dial down rather than turn it up, and I hope that happens, but it's hard to have any confidence that it will. Do
you see anything on the pre-election horizon that could suggest that there be something that could damage Trump's campaign through the election night?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know because after all these events happened in the end of 20 and the beginning of 21. Right, we're now in the fall of 24. It seems to me that nothing new is really going to come out here. What happened is, the Supreme Court issued its immunity decision. It provides some guidance, perhaps not enough guidance, and then they sent the case back down for the indictment to be reframed in a way which would be consistent with what the Supreme Court said can be prosecuted and what cannot be prosecuted. Smith has gone and gotten a superseding indictment from the grand jury. Some of it's kind of laughable. He
define superseding for people who aren't lawyers.
Superseding and just replacement, I think, would be maybe an easier word. That he's gotten a new indictment. A lot of it is just the same, except he does things like take out the reference to Trump as president or a candidate who's running for president. I don't think that's going to do him any good. But I do think it's not crazy to think, given the Supreme Court decision, that there are some things that can be outside the realm of immunity. Maybe he gets to proceed with respect to the interaction that Trump had with state election officials or state electors, because it's not part of his presidential responsibilities, and maybe some of that stuff can still go forward. I still have a problem with it because, as I see it, at the end of the day, what you have here is Donald Trump making claims about who won the election that he could not back up, and bringing lawsuits that he really couldn't press to trial, and which he didn't. They all failed, and then making some what I think are wrong legal arguments about what the 12th Amendment means and whether Vice President Pence could, refuse to accept the electoral votes or delay the account. But the thing of it is all of that is argument. All of that is speech and the assertion of legal positions. It could not have succeeded unless the United States Supreme Court said that he was right. I don't think there was ever a chance for that. I mean, even John Eastman wasn't sure he'd get even a single vote for the position that he was taking. And I have a hard time thinking that any of that can amount to a crime, but we'll see.
Where were you on the immunity decision by the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, I think that there has to be, I think it's not unreasonable to infer some measure of immunity from the fact that a president is charged with the following responsibilities and obligations. I think that what they needed to do, given the fact that this is an issue that comes up very, very rarely, is it would have been better for them to provide more guidance as to exactly what they meant. Because the way that Roberts wrote the decision, it's possible to say that it would have all sorts of sort of untoward consequences. Could he accept a bribe and that type of thing? I don't think Roberts meant any of that, but I think that the opinion could have been written with more clarity, even given the fact that, courts usually don't like to decide issues that are not before them. But I think here there was a need to set out a framework that maybe would provide a little bit more guidance than actually occurred.
Is it safe to say, from a legal perspective, that a president of the United States, or a former president in the case of Donald Trump, should not get involved in the administration of elections which are conducted at state level? Is that a safe legal?
Well, I mean, certainly that's what the Constitution contemplates, right? The states run the election. Now, Congress can pass some regulations, and it does, and then the executive has to enforce those regulations. But I think that we're all better off if partisanship stays out of election administration, and that doesn't always happen.
Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I always want to leave time for Rick to tell us what's on his mind, so we'll give him a segment for that. And we'll wrap it up before we get to the Jeff Sherman Upswing Show, which is after the top of the hour news, which is 10 o'clock for you youngsters out there. All right, quick break here on 620 WTMJ. Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, joining for a great hour of information. I wanted to always give you a chance, just a quick segment on something that's on your mind. You want to get out. It can be controversial. It can be whatever it is, because I've seen your tweets, Rick. I read that stuff. We get into some great discussions on, and I appreciate the back and forth.
Yeah, well, Twitter could be good, but it's not.
It's not good. No, it's not good. I want to make it better, but it's not my thing. Elon Musk is in charge of that.
Yeah. So two things. First of all, on election night, one of the things that I think will be interesting to watch is whether or not the Republicans seem to be doing better than they were expected to do. If that's so, then it may well be that one of the surprises in the Senate races will be here in Wisconsin, because if you look at the polls right now, I think it's fair to say that the Hovde-Baldwin race is closer than other races in the upper Midwest. And if it turns out to be a Republican night, maybe that pushes Hovde over the top. The other thing, since we're talking about politics and elections, is, we're going to get through this election year here in November, and then we're going to go right into another big election, and that's going to be the election in the spring for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The balance of power on the court between the more conservative and the more legal left progressive judges is going to be up for grabs, because Ann Walsh Bradley is retiring, and there will be a race between a left of center candidate and a right to center candidate. I don't think that those things translate exactly into the politics, in the sense that if you're left to center, you're always going to vote for the Democratic position, right to center, always for the Republican. But I think you're going to have two different judicial philosophies and understanding of how you read the law and how you read our Constitution on the ballot. And the outcome of that is going to have a great impact on the state of Wisconsin, maybe bigger in some ways than the presidential race.
I'll make a prediction. The last election for Supreme Court was the most expensive ever in the country. This one will beat that.
I'm afraid that's right.
Yes, in which, my opinion, not a good thing.
And, right, because you can't spend that much money to talk about the law, because nobody will listen to that much law talk.
He is Rick Esenberg. We'll wrap it up with Rick. Great conversation. If you missed any or all of the conversation, it'll be available on our podcast page, WTMJ.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll wrap it up with Rick after this on 620 WTMJ. I've really enjoyed the conversation with my friend Rick Esenberg. He is president of Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. And again, I want to give you another chance. People want to find out about your organization. How do they do that? www.will-law.org is the website. All right. I'm going to ask this question because a lot of texters are curious. The fake electors, the alternate slate of electors, whatever terminology or phrasing you want to use. I guess the question that I'm sort of putting together with all the questions on the text line, WTMJ Talking text line, is any of this in Wisconsin going anywhere? I know they're looking into it, or
no, I don't think so. Not here. I think that I had nothing to do with it, but I think what they were trying to do is preserve a legal claim at a time when there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not absentee ballots had been cast properly, whether or not there had been fraud. There was a petition for cert pending before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, so the litigation wasn't over yet. The lawyer said that you got to cast the electoral vote, so you'll lose the opportunity if you win the court cases. Different things happen, I think, later on. We can talk about them, but I think the notion that even if you think that this was futile, and I do, even if you think that the legal claims were not good, and I don't think they were good, the notion that lawyers would be charged for a crime over this, I think, is ridiculous.
How do you explain the difference between some states actually pursuing this now in courts and Wisconsin sort of on the edge of that?
Well, I mean the case is there here in Wisconsin. I think that I would be reluctant to assume that it's necessarily the same everywhere. I am familiar with what happened in Wisconsin. I don't think that there's even a colorable criminal case there. Whether there are other facts that would make for a case in some other state, I don't really know.
You and I have talked before about ballot boxes. You say there's no language that allows these things.
There's not.
Yeah, but yet we have them.
Well, we have them because,
How does that happen, Rick?
Because the Wisconsin Supreme Court apparently decided that a clerk could be an inanimate object. It could be a box. Now, I think that, in our report on the 2020 election, we said, look, we don't really see a great need for drop boxes, but if you want them, just make sure that there's some uniformity and some rules about where they'll be placed, how they're handled, how they're emptied, provision for monitoring. The problem is because the law doesn't really provide for them. There is no law. There is no requirements with respect to any of that stuff. And so the problem with drop boxes is going to be in the fall how they're used. Our report found that sometimes they were used responsibly, including in very blue counties, but sometimes they weren't. And we'll see what happens in the fall.
Do you think, this is the last one, I got to make it quick, do you think clerks in Wisconsin, whatever form, county, city, have too much discretionary power?
Sometimes. And, I think most all of them try to do a good job, but sometimes they just don't have the guidance that perhaps they should have.
Rick Esenberg, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming in the studio. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Take care.